We don't care who's riding the motorcycle as long as we're getting to ride along. I mean, that's a whole different thing, and we're not into that. We went through that 30 years ago when we grew long hair, and the rest of the Texans had cowboy hats. I mean, it's like everybody has an opinion, but the main thing is to have a good time. If you're, ride a motorcycle, play music, whatever it is, have a good time, and leave the rest alone.
Houston, 1977. Frank Beard finally had real money, a $72,000 check. He later said every dollar went to drugs. Not some of it, every damn dollar. Frank finally had rock star money. Problem was, he already had the rock star habits. He sold his original drum kit, his marriage started coming apart, and the drummer who had helped complete ZZ Top's classic lineup was becoming the biggest threat to his own career. Then ZZ Top hit the brakes. Billy Gibbons went one direction, Dusty Hill went another. Frank had to get himself clean. Most bands would have made the obvious move, but Frank Beard wasn't just some hired gun they picked up along the way. And that was about to matter. Before ZZ Top, Frank Beard and Dusty Hill were already surviving some pretty strange gigs together. And none were stranger than the time they toured as the Zombies. They were not the Zombies. The real British group had broken up, but Time of the Season was taking off in America. Promoters saw money sitting there and sent unauthorized versions of the band onto the road. Frank played drums, Dusty played bass. So people bought tickets expecting a British invasion band and got 2/3 of the future rhythm section of ZZ Top. Technically, that's a scam. With 50 years of hindsight, they accidentally got a pretty decent upgrade. Frank and Dusty had already crossed paths through the Texas circuit, including American blues, and they knew exactly how the other guy played. They'd also worked around serious blues musicians, including Lightning Hopkins. That mattered, because when Frank finally got his shot with Billy Gibbons, he already knew exactly who he wanted standing to his left. 1969. Billy was starting over after the Moving Sidewalks. An early version of ZZ Top already existed, with Dan Mitchell on drums and Billy Etheridge on bass. Then Frank came in behind the kit. When Etheridge eventually left, Frank had a recommendation: Dusty. Not some studio hotshot, not whoever a manager had lying around. The bass player Frank had already spent years grinding beside. He helped bring in the bass player who completed the lineup. On February 10th, 1970, Billy, Dusty, and Frank played their first show together at a Knights of Columbus Hall in Beaumont, Texas. That's the classic ZZ Top lineup. And I like that it started there, not an arena, not some glamorous record industry showcase. A Knights of Columbus Hall in Beaumont. About as Texas as this story could possibly get. From that night forward, the chemistry was simple. Billy could wander wherever he wanted on guitar because Frank and Dusty were underneath him, sitting in the same pocket they'd been building years before ZZ Top existed. Now they just needed somebody outside Texas to notice. On ZZ Top's first album in 1971, Frank wasn't even credited as Frank Beard. He was Rube Beard. The nickname appeared again on Tres Hombres. By then, though, people were starting to figure out who these three guys were. 1973's Tres Hombres broke the band nationally, and Grange put that greasy Texas shuffle right in the middle of rock radio. Then came Fandango and Tush. The rooms got bigger, so did the checks. For years, Frank had played wherever somebody would let him set up a kit. Now ZZ Top was a major touring band, and for the first time in his life, Frank had serious money coming in. That's usually the part of a rock story where everybody celebrates. Frank's version went a little different. In 1977, Frank cashed a $72,000 check and later said every dollar went to drugs. Frank joked years later that before 1977, he simply hadn't had enough money to become a proper addict. Then the money showed up. Problem solved. It started with LSD. Pills became part of keeping up with the road. Cocaine entered the picture. Then heroin. And Frank never tried to make himself sound innocent afterward. He liked heroin. That's what made the whole thing so dangerous. This wasn't some cleaned up rock star confession where the drugs were always terrible and everybody supposedly hated every second of it. Frank liked getting high, until getting high started owning him. He eventually sold his original Ludwig drum kit for drug money. That's the detail that gets me. You spend years fighting your way through clubs, fake bands, and lousy gigs because all you want to do is play drums for a living. Then you finally make it, and the drugs convince you to sell the damn drums. Frank married Catherine Alexander in April 1978, but that relationship wouldn't survive the period either. Money disappeared, gear disappeared, the marriage eventually disappeared. Frank later looked back on that stretch and called it what it was, a regret. And somewhere in the middle of all that wreckage, ZZ Top finally stopped moving. By the late 70s, the band needed a break. Years of recording and touring had run everybody down, so ZZ Top went on hiatus. Billy traveled. Dusty disappeared from the rockstar treadmill for a while, even taking a job at DFW Airport. And of course, Billy and Dusty eventually showed back up with the two giant beards that would make them look like escaped Old Testament prophets for the next several decades. Frank had a different problem. During that hiatus, Frank entered treatment in Houston to get clean. He told manager Bill Ham he needed time. Ham didn't hand his job to somebody else. He told Frank to take what he needed. That's worth noticing, because rock bands are businesses, and businesses aren't famous for patience when somebody becomes unreliable. But Frank wasn't just an employee to these guys. This lineup had been together since 1970. Frank and Dusty went back even further than that. Dusty later described Frank as somebody who went hard at everything, including the bad stuff. But when it's somebody you've spent half your life beside, eventually the question isn't whether he's being difficult, it's whether he's going to survive. Frank finally wanted to. I just wanted to get sober. And what he wanted afterward wasn't another giant tour or a bigger house. He talked about admiring people who could simply stay home, watch television, and go to bed. That's a hell of a dream for a rock star. Normal Tuesday night. Frank got clean. ZZ Top went back to work. Then, just when he'd fought his way back behind the drums, the music business came up with something new. A machine that could play them. ZZ Top came back in 1979 with Degüello. Then El Loco started nudging the band toward electronic sounds. By 1983, they went all in with Eliminator, Gimme All Your Lovin, Sharp Dressed Man, and Legs. Suddenly, there were synthesizers, sequencers, electronic percussion, and programmed rhythm tracks all over the place. The band that sounded like it had crawled out of the back room of a Texas bar suddenly sounded like somebody wired that bar into NASA. And for Frank, there was some nasty irony hiding inside the biggest album ZZ Top would ever make. He survived heroin, got himself clean, saved his place behind the kit. Then, technology started taking pieces of the drum performance out of his hands. The production of Eliminator leaned heavily on programmed and electronically shaped rhythm parts. Frank's human playing was mixed into a much more controlled, machine-driven sound than the loose shuffles he'd built his reputation on. For a drummer, that's a weird kind of threat. Nobody walks in and says you're fired. There's just suddenly a machine sitting there that never gets tired, never speeds up, and probably doesn't spend 72 grand on heroin. Frank adapted, and once those songs hit the road, somebody still had to sit behind the kit and make all that precision feel like a rock band. Eliminator sold more than 10 million copies in the United States. ZZ Top became MTV stars. And a few years after Frank had been selling drums to feed an addiction, he was sitting behind one of the biggest albums of the decade. That's already a ridiculous comeback. He still had another 40 years to go. The records kept coming with Afterburner, Recycler, more tours, and a whole lot more years on the road. By 2004, ZZ Top was in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Frank would eventually play on all 15 studio albums, from the 1971 debut through La Futura in 2012. Health did force him off a few shows over the years, and other drummers stepped in when he couldn't play. But filling in for Frank was never the same thing as taking his job. He wasn't pushed aside, blamed for holding the band back, or handed one of those carefully polished statements about moving in a different direction. Frank was still ZZ Top's drummer.
Dusty Hill is dead. The iconic 70s classic rock band made the announcement this morning.
Then in July 2021, Dusty died. At his request, longtime guitar tech Elwood Francis stepped in on bass, and the band kept going. For the first time since 1970, that three-man chemistry was gone, but Frank stayed behind the kit. In March 2025, health problems forced Frank away from the road for a time, with John Douglas covering dates. Frank made it back, but by 2026, his health had declined again, and Michael Monaghan began taking the shows he couldn't play. This time, Frank didn't make it back. On August 17, 2026, Frank died at 77.
Longtime drummer of the legendary rock band ZZ Top has died. According to a statement from the band, Beard died at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, while in hospice care, surrounded by family. 77 at the time of his death, Beard was not a founding member of ZZ Top. After the band had already made its debut, he partnered with frontman and guitarist Billy Gibbons, and it was Beard who was responsible for bringing bassist Dusty Hill to the group.
Billy said Frank's signature backbeat had been key to keeping ZZ on top. And I think there's something important in the way this story ended. I've told a lot of stories about drummers who helped build a band, watched the money get huge, and then found out loyalty had an expiration date. Frank got something different. When he was at his worst, ZZ Top had every excuse to move on. Years later, when the sound changed and machines started creeping into the music, they could have decided somebody else fit better. They never did. Frank once put it about as plainly as a man can. I never wanted to quit and never wanted to get fired. He got his wish. 56 years after Frank helped complete that lineup, nobody ever had to tell him the chair belonged to somebody else. The drugs damn near took it. In the end, his body did. ZZ Top never fired him.